Made a swiveling, rotating yarn slash string holder using a Lazy Susan bearing, turning it on the lathe, and I thought I'd make a short video on how to use these Lazy Susan bearings and put something like this together. Stay tuned. The idea I had was to recess this bearing in the base of this turning. So I measured the side to side, corner to corner measurement, measured the hole in the middle. The idea was I would turn a round base on the lathe and also hollow out a section of the base so that this bearing would sit below the seam, so to speak, so that when you looked at the edge of the finished product, you would not see the bearing, but it would be kind of recessed down into the wood. So what I was doing here was just making sure I had my outside and inside diameters figured out so that when I turned this larger circle, I would turn a inner circle or two to recess the bearing in the base of the work. This will kind of show itself here in just a second as I put this piece of wood on the lathe. So first of all, I just did the measuring, used a compass to make some circles. I ended up having to do this more than once to determine where my cutout would be, or where my recess would be. The outer diameter of the piece of wood was just based on the width of this piece of wood. It was a piece of scrap cherry, and I was going to hollow out basically a ring, leaving the center raised and obviously leaving the perimeter raised so that it would hide the edge of the bearing. This will all make sense in just a second, but here I was just trying to get all my dimensions right. I get my rough cutout right so I could hack this out of this piece of wood, clip the corners off, and mount it on the lathe and try to get myself a even circle. So this is sort of an idea of what this was going to look like and how this was going to work. So here it is now laid out. I've clipped the corners off, I've mounted it on the lathe, found my centers. It was a little bit wobbly, but it didn't take long to get it a smooth circle and flat front and back. When I flattened the front and back, obviously I lost my pencil lines, and so I had to remeasure, but it wasn't too big a deal. So this turned very quickly. Again, this was dry cherry, and it was a 5/4 piece of wood, so it was only about maybe 15/16 wide or deep, and once I had leveled both edges, it was probably down to 7/8 when it was done, which worked out great because those bearings maybe stand about 1/4 of an inch tall, so I had plenty of space to recess the bearing in the base. And again, my goal was to hide the edge of the bearing when the product was finished. So I just used my lathe tools to round out this base. This one tool I have, it's got edges basically on 3 sides, so it's easy to just run it alongside the work like this to level out that face. And it didn't take long until I had a perfect circle. Then I made a couple of deep marks and to determine where the recess was going to be, and I just hollowed out this recess using that same tool. It gave me a flat bottom, and so it allowed for the bearing to sit in there level and flat, and again to be recessed well within the base so that you could not see the edge of the bearing once it was mounted. I'll go into how that was mounted in a little bit, but I started to finish this piece, sand it, smooth it. It needed a little bit of work. I hollowed out a little bit of this outer edge just to give it more of a decorative look. I softened the corners a little bit. This is 80 grit paper. I went down to 220 to get it smooth, and you can see how that bearing fits in there, and fit perfect. Worked really nice. I took it down just a little bit further to get it to fit a little nicer, and then I started working on the top. And the top again is just a little bit smaller diameter. It's got a little recess cut in it. You could say a rabbet cut in the edge that kind of sat down inside the recess above the bearing. This will all make sense again in just a little bit as you see this come together. But I just basically did this for decorative purposes. I flattened that just similar to the other one, kind of rounded the edges. I put a little bit of a quarter round on it. I use these for inside diameter, outside diameter, to make sure my recess that I cut, or my rabbet you could say, was going to fit inside the recessed area. So here I marked that inside diameter using that tool. And then I used the other tool, caliper, to mark the outside diameter. And I wanted to make sure that my finished product was at least that size or smaller on the outside, and at least that size or smaller on the inside, so that it would sit in the recess. Again, I made a kind of a quarter round on the top edge and a rabbet, so to speak, on the bottom edge, in order to have that sit on the bearing and down recessed within the base. Cut a line in it, burned a line in it just to give it a little bit of a decorative edge, and hollowed a little bit to make sort of a crown to where the shaft would stick up in the middle. Just thought it would look a little smoother. Here's almost finished top piece, and then I stuck a piece of cherry in the lathe and made the center shaft. I drilled it with a Forstner bit, a 1/2-inch hole in the top piece, and so I had to make a 1/2-inch tenon in the bottom of this, and I found an easy way to get an accurate 1/2-inch. If you used a 1/2-inch, I used a 1/2-inch Forstner bit for the hole. I use a 1/2-inch open-end wrench as my caliper, so to speak, and when the 1/2-inch wrench fits tight on the tenon, you know that the tenon's going to fit tight in the 1/2-inch hole that you drilled with the 1/2-inch Forstner bit. And so I just kept running this tenon down to size till the wrench fit on it tightly, and I knew I had a perfect fit for that 1/2-inch tenon. And it indeed just turned out very tight. Honestly, just hand tight. It's in there so tight that I don't even think I need to glue it. It'll be easier to pull this thing apart if you ever wanted to just store it somewhere. Then just for decorative reasons, I put some shape in this so that it wasn't just a dowel. And then I pointed the end so that it was easy for you to shove a ball of yarn over the top edge. And most of these I've seen look like this. Again, this wood was so dry it did a little tear out, but it yielded quickly to the sandpaper, and I got a good finish on it with just a little bit of sanding. I'm going to show you now with just an animation illustration a little bit how this thing ended up going together once I had all these parts formed. So here's a sort of an animation. Again, the bearing sat down in this recess, and it is mounted to the base with 4 screws. But then something you have to do with a Lazy Susan bearing is drill a hole. You can see I drilled a hole in the base for access for a screwdriver, because you need access to the top 4 screws. And so with that hole drilled, you can access from the bottom and put the screws in to the top. That way you've mounted the bearing and the fastening is all hidden. Then I just put a quick coat of shellac. After a little bit of sanding, I did a coat of shellac, sanded that down to 220, and then used paste wax to give it a finished coat. I found that on this hard cherry, 1 coat of shellac, sanded to 220, and then apply paste wax with steel wool and a good hard buffing, and you get a nice finish. Super easy, super forgiving finish. I tend to do this every time I use cherry, and I think it gives a great finish. It's not real glossy, it just feels good in your hand, and I think it protects the wood plenty good. So after that sanding and the applying of the wax and buffing, I think my wooden parts were pretty much ready to go. Then it was time to mount the bearing. And the bearing, again, mounted down into the base. And here I'm drilling the access hole in the base in order to get access with a screwdriver to mount the bearing to the top. And I didn't want any blowout, so I drilled a tiny hole all the way through and then used a Forstner bit and drilled halfway through each side. So I got a very clean hole in the base. Even though it's underneath it makes it look much more on purpose when you don't get blowout. And so got a nice looking hole in the base of the holder that worked great for the screwdriver. So then, using a centering bit, I drilled these 4 holes in the base and used, because I had recessed this bearing, almost more than halfway through this 5/4 piece of wood, the screws were going to be too long. And so I ended up putting the screws, this bearing came with screws and washers, and so I just put a washer underneath the screws to hold them up a little higher, and screwed it down to the base. Worked great. Again, it's all hidden. None of this shows because of the way the top is recessed into the edge, and so it mounted quickly and nice and level, and again in a hidden way and very securely. Once I had that bearing screwed down to the bottom, I checked it for free rotation. It worked great. I had already pre-drilled the holes in the top, so then all you had to do is line up that access hole with the bearing and start a screw through there. Because I had pre-drilled the 4 holes, once I got one of those in place, as you rotated to each of the 4 locations, the holes lined up perfectly. And because the top of the thing was the full 5/4 still, I had plenty of room for the full depth of the screw. So it mounted up really well, spins really easily, and there you have it, a rotating yarn holder using a Lazy Susan bearing, turned on the lathe. Super quick, super easy project. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, please subscribe, and thank you for watching.